So let's then move into our panel, and this is similar to a panel that we have as we go out around the state, and that is really kind of having a reality check, understanding from the leaders on the ground across our state what's happening, what's not happening, how we can support your efforts at the state and federal, tribal, and even local government level. I'm glad to introduce Molly Mowry, who is the co-founder and the executive director of the nonprofit organization called the Community Wildfire and Planning Center. She's also a member of what you just heard, that work group, our Task Force Fire Adapted Communities work group. Over to you, Molly.
Thank you, Secretary. Can you hear me okay? Sounds like there was a little bit of volume issue, but I think that's good. So we'll just get started. So again, my name is Molly Mowry, and I appreciate the opportunity to moderate today's panel. I would welcome all the panelists down because I'm about to introduce you shortly. So we want to make sure we can see your names and faces together, hear about you. As Secretary mentioned, I serve as the executive director of a nonprofit organization called the Community Wildfire Planning Center. We focus on helping communities and government agencies prepare and adapt to wildfires, particularly through strategies that focus on land use, development, and policies and regulations that affect the WUI, the Wildland-Urban Interface. I'm also part of the FAC work group, as Steve and Eric mentioned. So I would like to briefly introduce our panelists, and then they'll share more about their backgrounds and expertise when they speak. So first I have Frank Freevault. Frank, it's good to see you as always. Frank has 43 years of local, state, and federal fire service experience, and he served on the executive boards of the California Fire Chiefs Association and the Western Fire Chiefs Association. In April of 2023, he was selected as the director of the new Wildland-Urban Interface Fire Institute at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Will, at the end, Will Harling is co-lead for the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership and the director of the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council. Will has been shaped by fires in the Klamath Mountains his entire life, and through his work, he has helped bridge social, cultural, and ecological and economic aspects of human-fire relationships to provide one of the best examples, which I know we'll talk about or hear about more, one of the best examples of communities implementing the cohesive strategy. Next to Will, we have Rihanna Jones. Rihanna is of Salt River, Pima, Maricopa, and Washoe descent. Rihanna holds a bachelor's degree in botany and a master's degree in plant and environmental science, and she has been the environmental director of the Washoe Environmental Protection Department since 2021. Rihanna grew up near the Tahoe Basin, and she has seen multiple wildfires devastate her community's natural and cultural resources, and her work has been focused on cultural fire, fire restoration, and the incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge into science and policy. We have Scott Tengenberg, who is the forest supervisor for the Cleveland National Forest in San Diego, Riverside, and Orange counties. He's also the lead administrator for the 4 Southern California National Forests for fuels and vegetation management. And last but not least, we have Kelly Jane West, who's the executive advisor of the Butte County Fire Safe Council and formerly served for 18 years as the executive director of the Butte County Fire Safe Council. So during her time there, the community experienced many catastrophic wildfires, including the Camp Fire of 2018, the North Complex of 2020, and the Dixie Fire of 2021. So Kelly Jane will talk more about their organization's fantastic accomplishments over that time. So all of our speakers will share more about their examples. I was asked to first share just a few moments of my own perspective on fire-adapted communities. And as I was reflecting on what I wanted to say, I thought more about my unique history with fire-adapted communities. When I first started working at the National Fire Protection Association in 2010, I was asked one day to create a new program, a new national program called the Fire Adapted Communities Program. This was born out of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy, which we call the Cohesive Strategy, which had just made its debut at that time. And no one really knew what a fire adapted community was. It was a very new term. We had fire adapted human communities at one point, but there was very little description about what a fire adapted community was, even in the cohesive strategy. So I was asked to lead this national collaborative with the Forest Service, with the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and many other national partners. To create this FAC model. And we're all kind of left scratching our heads going, what really is a fire adapted community? And how do you explain this really complex idea? Eric and Steve talked to it earlier. It's really an entire cohesive, comprehensive approach to fire adaptation for communities. So we were building this from scratch, but also trying to make it very palatable, very user-friendly, so communities would get on board with what this was. We didn't have a wheel at the time. We had something we affectionately called the sunrise graphic, which some of you may be familiar with. And it was fairly crude and rudimentary. But over time, in those early days, we started to come up with some catchphrases. We worked with the Ad Council on a national campaign. We said the more actions you take, the more fire adapted you become, which I still sometimes hear today, which is nice to hear. And we had this big launch in DC with a congressional reception on fire adapted communities. So things were really taking off, but there was also a lot of pushback. I remember going to a conference one time at around that time, and I was meeting some folks, some foresters from a state on the East Coast, and nice to meet you. I administer the Fire Adapted Communities program. I hate fire adapted communities. It's like, oh, and I don't like what you do. Like, wow. So that was not the best greeting, but I was like, well, what's the problem? And this person said, well, we already have Firewise. I don't know why you have to rebrand Firewise into something else. And I tried to explain, well, this is different than Firewise. Firewise is this program that's educational, as we talked about. It's a recognition program. And in fact, doesn't have an endpoint. You just have to embrace how complex it is. And this person didn't want anything to do with my explanation, so I think I tried to apologize on behalf of the NFPA and Forest Service, saying, "Oh, I'm sorry." And there was the sentiment that, well, it's just a phrase that's going to come, it's going to go. You're going to ask us to rebrand everything, and in 10 years it'll be gone. Well, the good news is 10 years later, it's not gone. And it's, in fact, I think, been growing a lot. And shortly after that time, I remember getting a call from folks at the Watershed Research and Training Center and the Nature Conservancy. And they said, we want to start a network. We want to start a network of peers dedicated to learning and, exchanging information. And, that was 10 years ago. And so it's really inspiring to see how much has moved forward, where we are today, particularly here in California, where it's on the leading edge of fire adapted communities. But we've also seen all the stats. I know Chief Berlant showed earlier, what's one that always sticks in my mind too, is that 50,000 structures within that 5-year period of how much we've lost. And so on the one hand, we've come a long way, we're still going a long way, but we have a long way to go. And so with that, I wanted to launch into turning this problem over to my panelists. Where do we need to go from here with fire adapted communities? We have accomplished a lot, but there's still many opportunities. And I know that's what our executive committee wants to hear more about too. So Frank, I thought I'd start with you. I referenced fire adapted communities being formalized in the cohesive strategy a number of years ago. And that overarching strategy really helped guide not only our activities for fire adapted communities, but also for promoting resilient landscapes and improving response and suppression. So given your history and background as a local fire chief and your current position now, I wanted to ask if you could share your thoughts on what are those important alignments between response and suppression and fire adaptation. Often sometimes it gets framed as either or, and it's not either or. It's working together to improve those cross connections.
All right, very good. Thank you. Good morning. When I look at fire adapted communities, and it is a great framework, I know I've referenced it quite a lot over the years. This morning, I think I'd like to respond to the connection, I think the highest priority connections right now, they're all relevant, but the most prioritized connections right now, time and space. On the response side, I think we've done an amazing job with integrating federal, state, local responses. I think we're very good at that. On the mitigation side, I think we can do better. We're still operating from kind of legacy positions. That makes sense. They've served us well for a long time, but we're in a new space, we're in a new time, and the future would predict that we're heading to a different place. So I think on the mitigation side, we've got to take a tack, maybe if I borrowed something from the sciences, right? We've had terrestrial sciences and oceanographic sciences a lot longer than we've had coastal sciences. It took us a while to figure out that extensions off the water into the land or the land into the water didn't match the complexities there economically, meteorologically, biologically. And I think we're getting to the space where we recognize the WUI needs to be treated in the same way as a system. It burns as a system, so we need to mitigate the risk as a system. Specific to those, then I would say on the residential or the residential mitigation, those are two components, as you heard from Chief Berlant. It is retroactive hardening to the tens of millions of inventory that we have now for properties, and it's also the defensible space. We also need to have community level mitigation. They're slightly different. Parcel level mitigations are largely about low frequency, low duration, ember defense types of threats. But once you start getting structure to structure conflagration, the heat flux off those outperform typical parcel level mitigations. So we have to dig in harder on the community side. It's not just a process of percentages, probably 30 to 70% would be the target. But we believe we have to address this in three fire pathways. If we're going to disrupt this conflagration loss of life and property, which is really what we're all responding to, we see it as three pathways: vegetation to vegetation at about a half to a quarter mile out of a WUI community. The community itself, if you think about it, is really, it sounds dispassionate, but a collection of fuels where structures are the primary property or primary fuel source. And once you get structure separation densities less than 70, if they're unmitigated, you can go farther if they're mitigated. You have the conditions for conflagration. And if we're going to disrupt that, we need to do it at the vegetation to vegetation space. We need to do it at the vegetation to structure space. That's the immediate area on the interface. That's where initial response by responders can make a big difference. And then we have to have high density parcel compliance at the structure to structure pathway, because we know the embers, as you've seen, will fly over all of that. The second area I would say that we need to look at in terms of continuity is we have a disconnect at the last mile. That's my local side speaking out. I started this journey when in 1 week I had a pair of homeowners pass a brilliant defensible space inspection off our local ordinance. And they were non-renewed later in the week from their insurance carrier for the same risk. And I, the supposed professional, could not explain that to them. So it started a journey for me where I realized the public safety way that we interpret risk in the WUI is disconnected at times from how that's done in the risk transfer industries. And so in addition to what we have here, we need to make that loss sequence visible and understandable to the business side. And then, and really only then, I think, can they value the mitigations. And we've got some great science behind this. We understand how to disrupt this, but we've got to make the loss sequence visible. And we need it on the public side too, because it's scarce dollars. We're headed into tough financial times. We've got to know how to prioritize best outcomes for the money that we're going to have. Thank you.
Scott, I see you nodding your head a lot as Frank is talking, and I know you work more on the landscape side, especially now with the wildfire crisis strategy. I wondered if you wanted to add your perspective on this overarching cohesive approach. I don't think actually, is that the slide we want to share? Okay, perfect. Great.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes. And as a representative for the Forest Service and an implementer of the wildfire crisis strategy, that is, of course, a national effort across the entire country, but one that has multiple landscapes across California that are receiving some targeted investment. I love this graphic, and I liked the graphic earlier as well about how the integration from the landscape to the community down to the home is the key connection, right, here in protecting communities and changing outcomes. That wildfire crisis strategy at that national scale is intended to recognize that we are at a crisis situation here, whether it was mostly climate driven or whether it's construction driven, whether it's the years of fire suppression driven, all of the things that have led us to where we are. We need to respond in an emergency way, just as we respond to the fire that's actually burning. And so with that sort of emergency response mindset, multiple landscapes across the state have been designated as focal areas. I work in and represent one for specifically Southern California. It is the largest landscape in our state, and yet it's a key to recognize that the interaction between the vegetation in the wildland and the proximity to millions of people and hundreds of thousands of homes does represent the place where we can realize the most benefit and need to do the most work. So with those landscapes being designated, with that focused effort being put on addressing the wildland, and I loved the interface statement that Frank made there, where they come together with communities. We have a local strategy in Southern California that addresses ignition reduction, right? So trying to stop the fire before it ever even starts. Montane forest conservation, while much of the state is, as you see on the graphic there with the Christmas tree looking things, a timbered landscape, quite a bit of Southern California is a shrub and brush landscape. And so we do have montane forest, but we also need to address not just montane forest conservation and ignition reduction, but also strategic fuel breaks. And you see kind of along the graphic there, how to break up the landscape a little bit so that there are chances for firefighters and suppression actions that Frank spoke to achieve some success, again, before it gets to the community. With those strategies, though, they can't succeed all by themselves. They must also have fire adapted communities. And it goes back to what we've heard all day long. It does involve that parcel level change, those changes in home hardening, that changes in defensible space, the community level use of those techniques so that all of those entities can have some collective defense. And we've seen this in action. We've seen this in success. So for example, past efforts to mobilize entire communities to engage in parcel by parcel actions in the San Bernardino Mountains, in the community of Angeles Oaks. Years ago, in the wake of the 2003 fires and the 2007 fires, there was a CAL FIRE and forest community partnership called Forest Care. We had local nonprofits helping administer it. We had CAL FIRE foresters helping administer it. And there was something like an 80 to 85% uptake. That many of the homes in that community took advantage of this program. And it was, in my belief, that along with landscape treatments, along with corridor treatments to reduce ignitions, what led to the successful outcomes that community realized in the face of the 2020 El Dorado fire. If not for that, they may have been lost. So really, I do see a need for us to further along the FireWise efforts that were spoken to earlier about how we can bring communities together, bring community leaders together, motivate that action, and realize some better outcomes.
Thank you, Scott. That's actually a great segue into the next question that I wanted to pose to Kelly Jane and Rihanna. As we're drilling down more specifically into fire adapted communities and your work, we know on the one hand, we've spoken to how it requires this comprehensive approach, but at the same time, our professional work can sometimes silo us into very specific areas of that fire adapted communities wheel. So we need to be collaborative, we need to be creative. And Kelly Jane, I wondered if you could start first and speak to your examples in your own work, how you balanced your expertise and contributions while working in a collaborative systems approach in your community.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I am very grateful to bring some stories from Butte County. To that point, we are a boots on the ground nonprofit with a capacity of about 45 staff at this point. And in that, being able to treat acres, this past year, about 3,000 acres of various funding sources from the state have been implemented. And with that, we've touched hundreds of parcels. So it's a very complex space when we are in the WUI, dealing with all those opinions. With that, one of the core success stories this year was working with our local CAL FIRE unit and implementing their vision of the vegetation management program, the VMP process in Butte County, where they were able to implement over 600 acres of prescribed fire this past fall. And our job as the capacity boots on the ground team was to make sure that all the administrative side of the contractors being hired to prep that land, as well as things like lunch showing up. So we were really grateful to serve, and it's been a long time coming to start getting our prescribed fire acreage up at that level. The other success that we wanted to share is that a lot of this education side is motivating folks to come out to events that they actually want to participate in. And so we've launched our grazing festival. We've had 2 really successful years with over 3,000 people attending. And at that space, we can talk about evacuation and all of the preparedness topics. But when we have just a regular sort of like, come learn about fire safety, we don't get participation. So with that, we had some goat yoga and goat competitions eating watermelon. And all of that speaks to the hearts and minds of the parents and the children. And my hope is that as we continue to evolve through these topics, we put more investment in the curriculums at the state level. And as a mother of 4, we have lots of fun ways to talk about fire preparedness. And I know we can make some big strides that way.
I think we all want to know when your next grazing festival is so we can try out some goat yoga. Thank you. Rihanna, why don't you share next your story and example?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. One thing I'd like to say is, it's great to be here just for tribes to have a seat at the table, literally and figuratively. That's something tribes don't always get. So thank you for having me. One thing I would say is capacity is always an issue for tribes. We're the environmental department, a staff of 13. We do a lot of work from restoration to fire mitigation to building up our cultural burn program. I would say one of the things with respect to the FAC wheel that we have done is, during COVID times, we had an emergency operations department that was developed out of need. It was determined that there is still a need for emergency operations, but with respect to wildfire mitigation, home preparedness, creating fire adapted communities. So what we are working on is separating duties between the environmental department and our Washoe environmental, or I guess it's emergency preparedness department. So we can address those areas of the FAC well that were previously unaddressed. Another thing I would like to say, and Forrest, if you can put up the healthy country wheel next. So the FAC wheel, is, I don't know if that works for all Indigenous communities. And as it was said earlier, each community may address the FAC wheel differently. So what a lot of Indigenous communities and through the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, which is different from the Indigenous Stewardship Network, but in line with the same framework, is how do we address what our cultural and natural resource needs are for our community, and how do we protect those cultural resources? So in a lot of these meetings, we often hear federal, state, local. We don't hear tribal. So it's been nice to hear that at this meeting. Thank you. But I think tribes are a huge untapped resource for the Forest Service, for small agencies, for fire safe communities to be doing this kind of work. One thing we are working on is boosting up a Native resource crew so we can address some of these issues, and creating a healthy country plan, which is similar to a fire adapted community plan, but it involves cultural resources. It's done by the people for the people, whereas a lot of our other land management or forestry management plans are handed down through the BIA, where we do need to hire a consultant such as, the wonderful people from Ascent or other environmental consultants to do this work, but putting it back in the hands of the community is huge. So I think, where you have instances where there is goat yoga or fun things for the community to do. As we plan our next cultural burn, we will be inviting the whole community. We will be planning a lunch or a dinner to have it be more of a holistic thing than just one aspect of the work we do. And as Don so eloquently mentioned, Indigenous communities were fire adapted communities long before those were even terms. There were land managers before those were even terms. So I would like to see, more funding set aside for Indigenous communities to do this type of work. I don't always know if Indigenous communities are part of fire safe networks, but I think there's a huge opportunity for tribes to be their own network and to work with fire safe councils. Again, I think because the tribe is, working with the BIA, they're often not included or part of the picture. It's like they receive their own funding, or that's a separate issue, or their rules are different. We'll let them deal with it. With a lot of the changes that have come down with respect to, bills being passed or more allowances for cultural burns or cultural burn practitioners, I think there's huge opportunity for tribes to do a lot of this work. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for sharing those perspectives on the framework of FAC, because I think we all are continuing to learn and it's continuing to evolve, and how we put those pieces together is really important, especially as the FAC work group considers what can be a more effective action strategy for the future. Will, next we have you. And, I was going to ask you a question that could really reflect on where we've come from and also where we're headed. We have this thing called climate change in front of us, with us now. And so on the one hand, we're trying to address past land management and development decisions while the goalposts are rapidly moving. This year was fortunately a lighter fire year, but I don't think at least I don't think that's going to be the norm. I think we have to prepare for what does it really mean to continue being fire adapted. So I wondered if you could speak to how you're balancing these, short-term needs with the long-term perspective of how we get to becoming more and more fire adapted. And how does your work reflect that?
Thanks, Molly. I'm a storyteller, so this is going to be, kind of our Klamath fire story from this year, which I think elucidates a lot of the points that we're talking about today. And I think one of the key things we've done in the Klamath is we've, started with those community out strategies, but then we've married them with the landscape scale strategies into the community. And I think that's one of the reasons, by building a shared vision from the local to the regional to the state and federal level, so that there's people in positions all the way to Washington that share that picture, we've been able to get a lot of amazing work done on the ground. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're a big focus of the wildfire crisis strategy. I just want to start out by saying my first burn as a state certified CARX burn boss at our property this year was on July 11th, 2023, in-season burn. And we had 28 local school kids ages 15 to 19 as our firing team. That's my daughter there on the right, and my son was also involved. And they were led by leaders from our local Siskiyou and Humboldt prescribed burn associations, as well as members of the Kuduk tribe. And I've been bringing kids to burns for 20 years, and they sit there from the safe distance and they go, But let me tell you, you put a torch in a kid's hand and you teach them how to properly use it, there is a primal connection that happens that most people have forgotten in the current age, which is, this human fire relationship that our tribal partners have been kind of trying to get through our dense heads for a long time. So just to say that, it took 20 years of community organizing to get to the place where our community would accept a community-led in-season burn, while wildfires were burning across other parts of the state. Our wildfire season began, I don't know if you're switching these slides for us. around mid-August when we had a series of thunderstorms that just bathed our entire landscape and lightning. And let me tell you, only you cannot prevent wildfires. I mean, there's a few other ignition sources out there. But right away, we saw that something had changed this year. And I think it really speaks to Forest Service Chief Randy Moore's direction in his annual letter of intent, where he directed line officers to use every tool available to reduce current and future wildfire impacts and create and maintain resilient landscapes, including the use of natural ignitions at the right time and the right place in collaboration with tribes, communities, and partners. So on adjacent forests and even within the 6 rivers on other districts, they did full suppression. But because of the community license, the social license we had, we took the 2023 SRF Lightning Complex from about 24,000 acres and managed it to 50,000 acres through strategic ignitions along pods boundaries, and Wade, that's potential wildfire operational delineations. With the support of the community. And this is a game changer. I mean, the Forest Service was able to count those 26,000 acres towards their treatment goals. And we brought fire back to forests that hadn't seen it fire in over 50 years safely, creating resilient conditions for the future. And we had less than 8% high severity fire. And as this picture shows, this was, right next to the community of Orleans. And a big kudos to the team, to the Kuduk tribe, to the local forest, and especially the local forest district ranger, Nolan Colgrove, who's also a HOOPA ceremonial leader. He engaged folks like me and the local wildland fire use module leader in the firing team that brought that fire down to the community, knowing that someday in the future, we've already had fire come down that line in 2006. But it wasn't local people that were bringing that fire back. And so now the teams recognize that, hey, the communities are someday going to own these fires. And we need to start to train the people of these communities to bring fire back in a good way. So it's not just about local people working around the homes and the professionals managing fire at the higher levels. It's all of us working together to bring fire back to our communities in a good way. If you want to switch to the next slide, this daily progression map of the 2023 SRF Lightning Complex really shows the magic of this fire, which was, when people realized that they were going to manage one fire to the boundary of the other fire that was there, it just made sense to connect them. And so that really helped set that stage. And I just want to highlight, one last thing is if you look over to the right, there was the Hancock fire, which was being managed by an adjacent team. Now that's deep in the Marble Mountain Wilderness area. It's an area that's one of our most intact fire regimes, and it was surrounded by recent fires, as in 2017 and present. And they put smoke jumpers on that fire. They threw several hotshot crews at it. And I think this really highlights the place that we're at in this state right now. We have 2 choices. We can either embrace fire like they did on the SRF Lightning Complex and manage it during these wet years to get those treatments done at large landscape scales, or we can double down on fire exclusion and fire suppression. And we've been getting pressure, like in the Happy Camp community, to just take out the words of managed wildfire from our community wildfire protection plan. And that's coming from Siskiyou Unit CAL FIRE, it's coming from Klamath National Forest, it's coming from County OES, Ed. And the community understands that they lost half their town in the Slater fire because we weren't managing fire correctly, that we were trying to keep all fire out. So I think it's time for, we need your help. Jennifer from the regional level and Joe from the state level to help work with our local units and forests to make sure that science is reaching the ground and that they are working with the communities, because we are ready to adopt that new strategy. So thank you.
Thank you. Before we open it up to broader questions, I just wanted to give all of you the benefit of, or the opportunity to share any final thoughts that could really crystallize what it is that you think you need to elevate your impact for adapted communities. Frank, we'll start with you. Just gives you again the opportunity to share any thoughts, any additional thoughts on resources, opportunities for fire adaptation.
I do have a list. The first would be the concept, our future is going to have fire in it. A lot more than we've had. And we're going to have smoke in the air. I think our only real choices are how we manage the intensity. And so if the sooner we can grasp that, I think the kind of solutions and strategies we need to adopt become a lot clearer. If we still think we can somehow dodge this, then we're not ready to tackle it yet. There's 6 quick items I would throw out there, and I can provide notes later, but we need to align around a core set of what I'll call mitigations that matter, the ones that get the best bang for the buck at the least amount. We don't need a lot more science on this. We've got a pretty good set that we can start with. We need a good structure spread model where structures are the primary fuel type. We need to understand propagation of loss through the communities. There's a couple of places working on that. I'm really positive about one of them. We need a WUI response rating. It's interesting, the risk transfer industries don't really understand how to value the different types of assets and their capability and capacity in these 3 fire pathways I discussed. And so one of the things we need to do is make that visible so that we understand what that benefit is and that they understand that too. Because we're going to have cascading financial issues here beyond just the environmental that we're facing. We need a data commons. We need to be capturing data at a scale we haven't seen before. I think that needs to probably have some form of crowdsourcing to supplement, but it can be agnostic to the collection sources as long as it's uniform. And then in post-fire reconstruction, we'll have a really good idea what's working and what's not. We've got a good start with 7A, but we're learning there's a lot more to that. And we've got the technology to do this. We can capture this. We've got to resolve the social and financial barriers to implementation and maintenance at scale largely by property owners. As we've heard, there's situations where an individual can't do the work around their home. There's places we can assist with that. But by and large, this is about making the case to people who are, they're just busy, they're living lives, working multiple jobs, getting kids to school. We've got to make the case about what they should be doing. And they shouldn't get different information based on different sources. And the last one is I think we can bring a dynamic component to the CWPP equipped with that data so that we understand the situational awareness of what the community situation is for propagation of fire through it. And so I think if we had those 6 items, that would give us some real groundwork for mitigation policy upon which we could build risk policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Scott, did you want to add anything?
Just briefly to reemphasize the value of the entities that JC spoke about earlier in the FireWise communities and fire safe councils, right? Landscape work is ongoing and it will reduce risk. But like Frank said, where those landscapes meet those communities, if even more effort and energy can be placed into developing local capacity, making local connections, and getting individual parcel owners to HOAs or local FireWise communities to actually coordinate the landscape treatments with the parcel and community treatments, that's how we actually achieve a holistic approach.
Thank you. And Kelly Jane.
Thank you. The capacity that the state has put in the pipeline through the county coordinator opportunity is incredible. And we definitely need to continue that as long into the future as possible. One of the spaces that we have found as a grassroots organization in connecting with our partners and building relationships is needing to have good models and how to conduct ourselves in basic things of being frustrated with each other, or competition, who's getting this money and why, and aren't our projects more important than other people's projects or what have you. And so a lot of that, our mantra has been in focusing on healthy relationships and building spaces where we're using, for example, our local community colleges, programs that are both project management training as well as like your color, your personality type, how you play well in the sandbox with others. And that's a little bit different than what we typically talk about because we want to see capacity increase, but we don't talk about the devils in the details of how do we conduct ourselves as good citizens. The other part of that is spilling into that space with education from, you know, the TK on up through high school and then at the JC and statewide college system, and having a comprehensive look of what would we want to be teaching our citizens across that space. And I haven't seen any plans written about that necessarily, and it would just be great to look at it from that comprehensive overview.
Thank you. Rihanna.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, I would say more allowances for cultural fire practitioners, TEK, and Indigenous science systems. Tribes are gaining more momentum and allowances, and I would like to see more of this in the future. More allowances for smoke and air quality, so tribes can conduct cultural burns and do prescribed burning or cultural burning outside of prescribed burn windows. With respect to cultural resources, the time plants need to burn or an area needs to be burned isn't always in agency burn windows. And then letting fires burn, as Will mentioned, manage it rather than extinguish it. More education and outreach for intentional fire, good fire, beneficial fire. Maybe more support financially to agencies such as like UNR's Living with Fire, or the fire pit that focuses solely on getting the word out about good prescribed fire. And then more allowances for bi-state agencies. We're the tribe of Nevada and California, so that there's a lot of cross-jurisdictional boundary issues that we deal with funding and grants we receive. So more allowances so we can do work across jurisdictional boundaries, across state lines. Thank you.
And Will.
Yeah, just to feed off that, I mean, I feel like so much of rural California is still operating kind of under this pall of an unrecognized genocide of indigenous peoples. And we are at risk of taking their traditional fire knowledge and using it as a tool without centering those tribes in the bringing back of that tribal fire knowledge. And I just, you know, I was talking with a friend this morning. It's like, what is the way forward in our community? And the reality, yeah, there was 1,100 acres that Huffman was able to get to do a land back of federal lands to the Cuddick tribe. It's a great step. It's huge, but that's 1,100 acres of a 1.4 million acre ancestral territory, to put it in scale. And so, you know, we're starting to get at the truth. And a lot of people talk about truth and reconciliation. But the reality, my indigenous friends tell me, is that you don't get reconciliation until there's actual reparations. And I think there's a lot more that the state and federal governments can do to honor tribes in the terms of, you know, reparations, giving them the tools to lift them back up to the place. And it's going to benefit all peoples on our landscape across this state. And then finally, my last thing for Joe, you know, I would really love to burn more with CAL FIRE folks. You know, I think, you know, if it's really a cultural issue that we're dealing with here, and there's so much powerful wisdom and knowledge of fire within CAL FIRE, and there's a lot of powerful wisdom and knowledge outside of CAL FIRE, and there's really kind of there's a artificial barrier there. Like we've had over 800, 900 people come through our climate treks program. I can count the number of CAL FIRE folks on one hand, and they didn't stay for the whole time. So like, I get the feeling like it's not of value to the state, although I think it is. And so I hope we can break down some of those barriers.
Thank you. Thank you all for bringing your honesty and your passion to this topic. Secretary Crowfoot, I'll turn it over to you for fielding or asking additional questions.
Thanks so much, Molly. This has been a really helpful panel for me personally, and I think a really great, well-planned morning for for my learning, and I imagine others in the room and online. I mean, I'll share just a few quick takeaways, and then I want to make sure that we have opportunities for questions. We have about half an hour for an exchange, so want to make sure you're thinking of questions. Great. Key takeaways for me this morning and with this panel are certainly not all communities are the same. It's not a one size fits all. We have to help, communities lead and build capacity. I really liked Callie Jane's example of the way that you've customized, bringing people out and educating them. And I got JC's point earlier that we need to help get funding out more efficiently and flexibly. We've done that on the landscape level. We're doing that on the landscape level, and I think emulating that on the local level makes sense. And then just to Rihanna and Will's points, I mean, I do believe we're on a journey as it relates to supporting tribal leadership, building government-to-government partnerships. I always talk about, I'm proud of our progress with so much more work that we need to do. I am thankful to Joe and Chief Tyler for his leadership at CAL FIRE, really working to modernize the approach to prescribed fire, but also recognizing prescribed fire is not the same as cultural fire. And we need to continue to learn from our tribal practitioners about cultural fire. And I hear you, Will, in terms of bringing, tribal governments, tribal communities together with our fire professionals. So Joe, I'd be interested in your thoughts there. And then just the importance of supporting the community working, out, and then the land management agencies working in. And Scott, really appreciate what you're doing because it seems like that's where the magic is. Frank talks about really as I understand it, having an approach around the vegetation, sort of managing the landscapes, but then the vegetation community. And so I thank you for your, leadership in the national forests that you manage working with communities, because it's going to be both, as we've heard today. And then lastly, Will's points about beneficial fire. I do think we're evolving. We recognize that the answer is not prohibiting or excluding fire. That's in part what got us here. And so how do we manage that? I would acknowledge that there's a lot of fear, of fire across communities in California, particularly given just the severity and destruction of these huge catastrophic wildfires. So, we have to continue, I think, to listen and learn from communities that are fearful about that. But ultimately, the answer is getting more fire onto the ground in a controlled and appropriate way. I think we all recognize that. 400,000 acres as a target for prescribed fire scares me because it's very ambitious. And you saw the numbers on the screen here this morning. We're not close. But I think that ambition reflects a recognition that from the state and federal partners, we need to get more fire on the landscape. And some of that is cultural fire, prescribed fire that's being ignited. But then some of it, as you point out, is taking advantage of natural ignitions where it's not, putting people in harm's way to be able to manage. So I am interested in how the task force over time really, builds awareness of that and has that, beneficial managed fire, safely and appropriately as part of our overall effort. So those are my high level thoughts. I get a sense Sam wants to ask questions or share thoughts. Advisor Venezuela.
Sure, and I echo your sort of takeaways. One additional takeaway for me, sort of the high level, is how much progress we have done in addressing or understanding and communicating the success from the built environment perspective. At the same time, as much work as we have done relevant to educating communities or building partnerships, I think there is a lot more to do in that space around capacity building, technical assistance, but more importantly, how do we measure that? It's easy to measure, X acreage of landscape or X amount of dollars invested in this area. So those are easy. How do you measure success in capacity building? So, and that's kind of a question to us as well as the panelists. I never thought handing out torch to kids was a capacity building mechanism. I learned something new now. That is very transformative. Just one piece there in terms of sort of longer term generational change. Obviously, the looking back to the past and native perspectives around dealing with the landscape. We need to go back to that as well. So just brief question is, in terms of capacity building, what should we prioritize? What is missing from the state's perspective? And then how do we measure success around that issue? So if there's, that would be my question to the panelists.
I did want to say, I think the state's funding through the CAL FIRE Forest Health and fire prevention programs have been game changers in our region. Like, that funding is building capacity at a rate that is unparalleled over the past 20, 30 years. It's those resources are being used during wildfires, but they're also doubling down to do prescribed burning. And I think we see that reflected in those numbers. I think I totally agree with you, Sam. It's not just about acres. This is about how many people know and understand fire, because that is where the social license comes. And I think it's critical that social license comes when people feel like they have a voice. Because if there's a team coming from the outside and they're going to do things on this landscape that people have lived their entire lives stewarding without any back and forth, that's a scary thing. And so they want to just put it out and get rid of it because they don't want to face it. But when we develop programs like the community liaison program that we have in the Klamath Mountains, where there's a communication pathway between those teams and the communities that those teams affect, then that starts to change, and there gets to be a shared story that we're telling together, and not competing factions and that are based with a lot of fear-based response.
Thank you. I think I would just like to say a brief statement with respect to consultation. Consultations with tribes aren't great, and I think there's been a lot of issues with tribes having meaningful consultations with other agencies. That definitely needs some work. We often, we're one tribe and we work with 80 agencies in the Tahoe Basin. It's very difficult to consult on all of those projects. With increasing capacity, I don't know if funding is the answer. I think it comes back to meaningful consultations and relationships with other agencies. So if there's some way where other agencies are required to work with the tribe, it's like now you're required to consult with the tribe if you're doing work on their homelands. How do we make the relationships so they want to work with tribes? So tribes are at the forefront of the work they do with cultural burning, with fuels reduction, with forest health. So how do we increase the tribe's capacity to do a lot of this work themselves? I think it comes back to more experiences for tribes, perhaps funding dedicated to tribes, as there's funding just for other community wildfire resilience groups that I mentioned before, tribes are often left out of. So how can we increase that capacity, have these meaningful consultations and relationships, more opportunities to work on task books, to get red cards, to become burn bosses, and to work with other agencies, and kind of prove that we are, responsible and at the forefront of the work we do with respect to cultural burning.
Thank you, Brianna. And I would like to say, in the spirit of your question about capacity, we have started working with our tribes in Butte County. We have 5 primarily that are in our boundaries. There's more, but those are the 5 primary. And we have 2 that are under contract in our forest health grants currently, help cutting and piling. We have others that we're working with on just understanding cultural involvement within the whole, forest health space of our county. The space I'm really excited about is getting out in the land with the tribal members and our educators to talk about, why are we thinning these trees to this spacing? Why are we leaving these specific native plants here? What is the food use for habitat or for us, for medicine in these places? And that's a place we haven't all gone together yet in the education capacity. We can see their fears reduced and their knowledge is increased of standing out in the forest and looking around, understanding what's going on around them. Then we will be making progress. And I think that only happens by us having the funding to get out in the field together and have those conversations.
Thanks, Sam. Frank, did you have, just real quick, and in support of that, 2 items for capacity. Please prioritize the fuel treatment dollars on the perimeter
of woo communities. And the second part is we can be a lot more efficient with the treatments if we do splats, strategic placement of landscape treatments on fire pathways, not to stop a fire outright, but to slow it down. And part of that has to do with doing mosaics for different types of overlays you can put on. So you can get a lot of effective acres at a fraction of the maintenance cost. So just two capacity things.
Yeah, thanks so much. And we're really excited about these regional toolkits and these planning tools like Planscape that are going to help optimize where communities are prioritizing, their fuel breaks. Just a couple notes on comments for those who are joining today that don't understand what consultation is. State government has a legal obligation to consult on a government to government basis with tribal governments that are sovereign governments. In the past, too often that's been either not been done or been a check the box exercise. So our focus is early, often, and meaningful consultation. And to try to do that in a way that's where a lot of state and federal agencies, so not as to, overwhelm tribes with desired consultation, but to really to do that consultation so it informs decision-making. I am really proud that CAL FIRE has set aside 2 years ago, last year, $20 million specifically for tribal wildfire resilience work, recognizing that tribes are governments, not other stakeholders, and they shouldn't have to compete. That was actually we hope that's a model in state government, and I think CAL FIRE released the transferred funding to those tribes that had applied earlier this year. So it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out, and our goal ultimately is to expand that. Others, Supervisor Valenzuela.
Yes, thank you. And I don't mean to be critical on any level here. So I'm going to go from the bottom up. One of the things I like to use is the cup of coffee routine. So the lady from the tribal thing, I mean, it's been problematic. I just came off being a board chair. I will tell you, I reached out to a tribe who should remain nameless. No response at all. And I think that's unfair to the process, if you will. Mr. Harling, I'm going to use you as I've been fourth term. I've never heard of the word, you before the Board of Supervisors giving a report on what's going on out there. And so, yes, everything that we talk about when it comes to fire, we're adapting. And I do think it's got to be lines of communication from the bottom up, not from I'm behind the dais and that doesn't work in the overall scheme of things. We got to implement things in a better way.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate the candid conversation. I mean, these task forces, meetings, I think we always want to make sure that there's real talk, that we as leaders of our respective governments are hearing direct input. And Supervisor, I appreciate the candor. It certainly is it's communication that has to happen in both directions. So thank you.
So just real quick, and I would just remind you, particularly a rural supervisor, there is no officer staff. So we have to be generalists by nature, but we're always open to have that kind of conversation.
And Secretary, if I may, I'd like to go back to Rihanna's point about capacity. We all face this. We are a few of many needs in the fire adapted communities world. I think it's I don't want to say small. We're small but mighty. A lot of us, when we go to conferences, we know each other by name because it is such a focused, specialized, dedicated group. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to speak to what that capacity really means. Like, how do we get from not having enough people to having more people like ourselves engaged in this work?
So thank you. And I totally understand. Usually when we get reached out for consultation, it is by email. And I think I probably receive 500 emails a week. So it's very difficult to keep up with that. One of the reasons why I'm here is because Forrest reached out, and he was one of the only tribal liaisons I ever have heard from in the past 4 years working in the basin. So maybe more tribal liaisons with every agencies, and then maybe more funding for tribes to have their own liaison to work with these other agencies and ensure things don't slip through the cracks.
And I would echo that in that our local university, Chico State, has hired a new tribal liaison in addition to the others on staff, and his role will be to build relationships, which we can then support. But his emphasis to us as a nonprofit and the other groups in our county, in our forest collaborative, where you should all hire tribal liaisons. And I thought, well, if he's doing the main job, how do we all fit in this space? But we know that there is a capacity issue for both our tribes and for our now one direct tribal liaison, we all want to participate. We all want to have these conversations. We do want to get out there and stand in the forest together, but we're still growing and we don't have enough people to do that yet.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on this bit on the conversation thread, because it relates to both issues that Will and Rihanna had shared. In terms of shifting the paradigm on this, and the capacity for tribes to engage. Yeah, tribes are taxed. I keep saying that over and over again, at these meetings. But in order to really frame things, I think the work of the task force, particularly with this the strategic plan for the beneficial use of fire. I always get, that's a long title for us, so I always get the words mixed up. However, under goal 3, it identifies several key things that one that stands out to me is like goal 3.3, giving tribes the opportunity to engage in leadership. Indigenous-led efforts for planning is a big piece of this. And so I think about like where that indigenous-led planning then can vision on a landscape and think about where and how fire is integrated into it is maybe a totally different approach than what we think about for say WUI, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's something that is inclusive of this. I mean, I think about this in the sense of like our villages were entirely flammable, and our approaches to stewardship historically included burning out to that half mile boundary around them pretty much on an annual basis. And so like these indigenous ways of knowing and doing our practices. And I think Will, like the example that you'd shared, I know a lot of the backstory on that. It's like 20 plus years of building not only the relationship between your organization and the tribe, but also with the Forest Service, to the point that finally you're able to actually implement something. But I guess to both Rihanna and Will, in the space of pods, like how do you envision that maybe being different? And pods being potential operation delineation units, which is one of the ways and strategies that the Forest Service is engaging in things. Like how do you vision guiding the agencies in being able to do this more?
Yeah, there was I mean, the writing is on the wall in Western Siskiyou County, right? We had the 2020 Slater fire that burned down half the town of Happy Camp. We had the 2022 McKinney fire that had 97 structures lost, 4 fatalities. And the reality is we have to have fuel breaks on the ground before those fires start if we're going to have any chance of changing their trajectories. And more than that, what we're seeing is these fires blow across those linear features and bathe the whole valley in embers. And so we need to use those strategic containment features as places to anchor much larger scale prescribed burns. So for us, what that looked like, because we live in this cultural landscape where, taking a 4 cat blade wide approach to every ridgetop just isn't on the menu. It was sitting down with tribal, federal and local partners, because we're in that FRA landscape, federal resource, what is it? Whatever that is, the federal landscape. And identifying those strategic features and who was going to do the work, right? Because sometimes it is a tribal crew that should be there. And sometimes we should just not use that ridge, even though it's a good ridge from a fire perspective. It's not a good ridge from a cultural perspective. But if we have those conversations on the front end before the fire starts, you preserve that relationship during the fire and then after the fire. So we need to be in the business of building trust. And that starts in the preseason of talking about how we're going to go after those fire events and how we're going to prepare for them. And so now we have an agreed upon strategy, not just a half mile, but 2 miles surrounding the Orleans Valley, where those strategic fuel breaks should go, who should do the work. And then, with the Bill and IRA funding, combining with the matching funding from the state and the NIFWIF program that's coming down, we're going to have the funds to actually bring fire from that 2 mile boundary down into town. So you know, keep an eye. It's some good stuff's gonna happen up there.
I am also all for pre-operational delineation lines, pods. I've been told that we wouldn't need pods if we had healthy forests, but obviously that's not the world we live in. So I think creating pods for indigenous communities with respect to cultural resources is very important. A lot of cultural resources get bulldozed over in emergency. There's an exception made through NEPA CEQA to disturb those resources. If we had these pre-operational delineation lines, we could identify those cultural resources ahead of time, build pods and fire lines around those, and then start creating that mosaic landscape, which leads back to a healthy forest.
Thank you so much, Patrick.
Question particularly for Frank and Callie Jane. Talk to us about the role of counties. My understanding, as we heard earlier from Daniel and Casey, that CAL FIRE a couple of years ago established a new grant program to have county coordinators throughout the state. And on the one hand, that seems ideal. You look at that fact wheel and you're dealing with open space, you're dealing with building codes, you're dealing with land use, you're dealing with transportation, you're dealing with social services. So on the one hand, the counties seem to be perfect. On the other hand, counties also seem to be overwhelmed with all those things at the same time. So what's your sense of how that program is going and the role of counties? You've got the leadership of CSAC at RCRC up here. What's your message to them about the county's role? Is it as an integrator? Is it a leader? Is it working well? What are your thoughts?
Well, I would just start off, I love our county. I'm a really big fan of counties and I love our county department heads. So, as well as our board of supervisors. But truly, my hope has been that our nonprofit organization, Fire Safe Council, would be basically the forest public works of our county, because most of our county capacity has been stretched in the disaster cycle since 2017. We've had 3 disaster declarations, and I just don't see the capacity to really wholeheartedly address a county evacuation, roadside clearing across the many miles, as well as the level of planning that it's taking within the WUI to get the results that we're looking for. So I think our planning department may have 6 staff and our fire council has a lot more. So I see them working synergistically. My wish would be that our county could have that, a whole comprehensive wildfire safety resilience department. But it's not designed that way. OEM does a great job, planning does a great job, Public Works does a great job, but they have very minor capacity compared to the need, and their funding is always stripped. So I think that county coordinator funding is essential, and having the way that JC showed on the slide, that those county funds come out at that county level to increase and support our counties.
Thanks so much, Frank.
So I think two things come to mind. One is, it is amazing to get that extra staffing in at the county level. I think to some of the other discussions we've heard today, a huge part of this, like right now, money is not actually the problem. I've never seen this amount of money, philanthropically, governmental, venture capital. There's a lot of it. It's more confusion about navigating the different programs. And, we all know grant money is not free, especially in terms of administration. And so I think that position could be completely consumed in just granting the local entities, the WUI communities themselves, situational awareness on what programs are available, which ones are the right fit for their community, how are those integrated with other plans? I was a local chief and I would frequently find out through the grapevine that there were 8 fuels programs that touched my community for which I had no knowledge. And it wasn't out of malicious, act. It was just so much stuff coming at the same time. The other thing I would say to the county members is that we're all focused obviously on the climate crisis that we're facing. And it's, for us in the West, it's wildfire, but it's, that's about 1/3 of the whole global piece. And we'll hit the rest of those too in terms of water, convective storms, et cetera. I can't underscore enough the linkage between fail to mitigate and the financial consequences. The cutting edge of this, the leading edge of it is insurance, is in risk transfer. But that, I believe, is going to migrate to mortgage lending. I think it may migrate to general obligation municipal bonds. I mean, if the risk transfer industries are walking away from coverage of properties because they don't know how to assess the risk, or it's too much risk to underwrite, I don't think it's too long before the municipal bond ratings somehow have to do the same price signaling, because the primary way you service the debt on those is the property tax. So I would just say that the position is good. It may be best served if we could provide training to those folks on understanding the landscape, the labyrinth of the financial resources, and then be more of a booking agent, if you will, to local governments. The local governments know where they need to do the work, but they're just as strapped too. So if I were going to do, two things to the county level, that would be my quick advice.
Thank you for those pragmatic suggestions. And I would open that up, that sort of funding workshop and education to other, agents of this kind of work, like resource conservation districts. So we get more experts that can interpret. I mean, we don't want to be creating all of these different siloed programs, but I think the reality of being large governments is that there's going to be some of that, natural or inevitably. So it's a great suggestion. Chief Tyler.
I appreciate the discussion today around fire adapted communities, and primarily what has been discussed here is it's a community-based approach. It is getting the buy-in from the community to help the agencies at all levels implement and make a difference on the ground. Some of the discussion has been enlightening today and reiterating to me today as well. And Will, I appreciate your comments there. Just a few things to think about, and it's about shifting cultures for us in many ways. The fire service culture is to protect life, property, and environment, but sometimes you have to modify the environment to protect life and property. And that is so important. One of the interesting things about the Klamath and the Six Rivers is a lot of those fires are burning on public lands versus private property. And we could have that discussion all day long about that. But Will, somehow you have, and this is what we can learn from you, is you have moved your community to buy into that process on their private lands to be able to manage fire, and what those benefits really are there. But I want to bring, and we all know this, and I'm just going to say it, we have to bring another aspect into the pressures that, from CAL FIRE's perspective, and probably from the Forest Service and their forest supervisors, get pressure, and it is the politics. Last year, fires in Northwest California, receiving phone calls of getting pressures of you're not putting enough resources to extinguish the fire approaching the community of Hoopa, is an aspect in which we have to react to, when instead recognizing the lack of normal fire intervals have got us to that point. But how do we continue to manage those fires for ecological benefit and cultural benefits as well, moving into that? Likewise, some of the pressures received in Northwest California at my level is how do you balance and manage fire for beneficial ecological benefit when you're getting extreme pressures on fires that have shut down the energy and transportation infrastructure going into the community at Crescent City? Those are the political pressures that are coming behind the scenes. But at the end of the day, going back to my point that I started with, fire adapted communities really is around community-based approaches and volunteerism that then allow us to get to that point of education, which is exactly what you were all talking about, to achieve that buy-in, to get the community to accept that the smoke impacts are in the long run going to benefit the overall state of California's landscape. I made a comment as we continue to increase the amount of prescribed fire across the largely Northern California of some of the new impacts we as a state agency were facing. And my relation was, while I can't understand at all what our indigenous tribes have gone through over the decades and last hundreds of years, it is interesting of those pressures that come from various groups saying that I shouldn't be burning, and yet the unit chiefs are continuing to embrace that and trying to increase that amount. So that goes back to the community buy-in as well. And I'll end with this. You know, on the Mendocino County, a lot of activity there working with, I believe it's 19 different indigenous tribes in that community, and using the local on-the-ground CAL FIRE personnel to engage in meaningful, early, and often consultation, which we need to be able to continue improving upon. Good in some areas, we could do better in other areas, but being able to introduce prescribed fire, working with Sherwood Valley and others in that area have really, they're going a long ways, but there's still a long ways to go. So I appreciate the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief Tyler.
Yeah,
Let's
and
follow up.
yeah, I
Oh,
want
yep.
to, Jen, we're gonna do this. I'm gonna ask you to reflect on the panel and then provide some closing thoughts for our morning here. We're gonna work to end the meeting and get everybody to the rest of the day and their weekend in about 10 minutes. So over to you.
So thanks. So again, Joe and Wade, thank you so much, and to the panel, just wonder, and the morning, wonderful panels, so much information. Two things, probably have some questions. So, you know, we either answer now or I'd love to hear the follow-up. The whole morning, as well as this panel right recently, you're talking about how complex this all is. And just looking at that, the bubble one of, you got shrublands, montane, you've got field breaks, you've got all of that in that area, how complex it is. We've discussed. I also look at it though, that you have multiple entry points for very different communities of practice to enter in and see themselves in this. So yes, it's complex, but wow, talk about opening up and having more people even be involved because they're concerned about home hardening, or I'm worried about my transportation being open and I don't want that closed, or I want to make sure the montane environments are being able to. We're burning our shrublands in Southern California way too much. How do we do all of that? So my question is, with all, you guys have described all the people that you're working with, how do you coordinate all of that? How do you have all of those people aligned and moving in? And we're trying to do that on our task force across the state and through our regions. But I'd be really curious as follow-up, if not now, then at another point of how do you actually know what's going on in Butte County, Callie Jane, with everything that's going and happening on that, with all of those multiple entry points and the ability to harness all that energy and interest, concern, fear, and moving it. And I get the financial issues, you know, that you had said, Frank, too, is how do you coordinate just grants? But how do you actually know and move and coordinate all of those moving parts?
Thanks for the question, Jennifer. And it does come back to the heart of trust and building capacity, which is the relationships. I don't have a social media account personally, and I don't know what's going on in social media. But I do know that if I have a concern at the county level, I can call Paula Danilek, our Department of Planning, or with the RCD, I can call my partner Wolfie. And so what we had done is set up standing partner meetings monthly. We can keep in touch. We also have our board meeting monthly. Folks come to that. And then there's just that trust and knowledge of, hey, I know where this organization's going, or I know where there's a capacity gap here, or I know what my tribal partners are needing. And we are looking out for each other, and we're having those honest moments where we can respect each other's territories and boundaries, and also where we want to see everyone move forward. It's a very personal approach.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So just really quickly then too, I know what I really appreciate about today is just having that community part of this. You can't, it's the people. Yes, it's the landscape, it's the people. And I'll talk more, like, Wade, you did such a good job of saying when we're talking about beneficial fire, and I'm totally excited about SRF. I was, involved in seeing all of that, as well as the quarry fire and the Stanislaus and all of that stuff here. And it's exciting. But Will, you pointed out there was a fire just down the road, if you will, in that area that didn't have the same approach. So what is one thing you do? And I'm looking at Scott too, because on the Cleveland, you're working with about 28 tribes of ancestral homelands in that area, as well as all of that millions of people and communities. So what's the one thing you would recommend that we all do to build that trust? Because as Wade and Joe were saying, there's a lot of fear out there, and there is a lot of pressure. And Will, you said it took 20 years to get some of this. So how do we increase, what's the book? How do you operate at the speed of trust? And so how do we do that? Do you have one thing to do when we're trying to manage all of that pressure and societal pressure? And you're in it too. You're in those communities. So I'd love to just hear really quickly, what's that one thing that you think we could do? Any of you, all of you?
Frank, just quickly, I think maybe I'm looking at it, approaching it the other way is that I think if we approach the loss sequence, and a lot of this is about conflagration levels of loss in communities. It's not the only thing, but it's a huge part of what we're responding to. I think if we respond to that and treat the mitigation of that as a system, how people enter and how we organize, a lot of that quickly becomes self-evident. So I think if we do it strategically to stop the loss sequence, it actually does a lot to answer the questions.
I would echo something that Callie Jane pointed out, that it's personal and it takes time and it takes communication and it takes convenings like the ones you all have been hosting over the past few years and will be continuing to host. So I see trust growing when I get the chance to meet with people and talk to them, and they see where I'm coming from genuinely, and I understand better where they're coming from genuinely.
I would add that making mistakes is part of this journey, and we try to make at least 3 mistakes a day. But in the honest part of that, sometimes we do hurt people's feelings, or we have things that didn't go the way we wanted, and being able to trust that with our partners and having a commonality that we're going to have some bumps in the road is really great to build a grit.
I say building trust is hard for Indigenous communities with government agencies because of, the past. One thing I've talked to some of our partners is to have them come down to our community, to come to some of our events, to see what some of our struggles are, to start building that trust. So again, we're only one tribe. We have to work with over 80 agencies. A couple people, if we don't have relationships with all of those agencies, we may have relationships with one person from that agency because they maintain contact, they check in, they come down. The forest supervisor came to our first cultural burn, and that spoke volumes to us. So I think, not us being involved in their projects for things that they need tribal consultation or participation in, but coming to our projects as well that have nothing to do with their agency, but it's supporting that community.
And just finally, I think SRF happened, the Lightning Complex happened because you had the Humboldt unit, CAL FIRE supporting that action. You had Humboldt County, Del Norte County supporting that action. And there was nobody in the room saying this is a bad idea. And right across the border, I was in those cooperator calls, and you had Siskiyou unit saying, you got to go direct. You had Siskiyou County saying, you got to go direct. And so the Klamath was supporting their local partners in that decision. And when the incident management team looks around, they look at who, what those decisions are, and they go with it. And so, I mean, the reality is, Ed, is that, I need to invest in coming to Siskiyou County meetings and, having those conversations. I would have loved to have been at the meeting when they were discussing this recent resolution to ban managed wildfires in Siskiyou County. I wrote a 2-page letter because I couldn't be there. But
I wasn't me, by the way.
Yeah, I know that. And so I think really it's, you know, investing in these local relationships, because only when there's that agreement across the board do you see those kind of C-level changes.
Thank you, everyone. Wade.